Okay, so now that we have our three separate data tables connected inside of our data model, we can report off this data model by creating a pivot table. So inside of our Power Pivot window, we can select Pivot Table. And then we can either insert this pivot table on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I'm going to click Existing, and then we have the option to select the cell within our worksheet of where we want to insert our pivot table. So instead of cell A1, we can click this little graphic off to the right and select a different cell that we want to insert our pivot table in. I'm going to select cell B3 and then click OK. OK again. And now we have inserted our pivot table. And then over here to the right, inside of our pivot table window, it's a little bit different than what we're used to. Because previously, when we were just working with one data set, we could only select the fields within that data set. But now that we have three different data tables, we can select different fields within each one of these. So for example, if I click the drop down for sales data, we can see all the columns within that table. And then if we expand the product data, we can select those columns as well. So let's pretend we only had one data set in our pivot table. And let's say that we only had the sales data. And if our goal was to see the total amount of sales for each product ID, we could select the total sales, which it automatically put in the values area and sum those cells because this column has numeric data in it. And then to see the sales of each product ID, we can grab product ID and click and drag it to the rows area. So we have done this before when we were just creating standard pivot tables. But let's take a look at our report here. We can see the total sales for each product ID, but we don't know the names of these products. For example, let's take a look at product ID P101. If we go back and open up our Power Pivot window, and then go to our product data, we can see that the product ID of P101 is a pencil, and P201 is tape, and so on. But you might not know that just by looking at the product ID. But since we have created the relationship between the sales data and the product data, and using product ID as the unique identifier, we can add the product name to our pivot table. So let's get back into Excel. And over here in our pivot table fields, underneath product data, we can click and drag the product name to our rows area. Now we can see that the product ID P101 is pencil and P201 is tape. But if you don't want to see the product ID and just see the product name, we can just uncheck product ID. And now our pivot table shows the total sales for each product name. But the only way we can make this happen is to create a data model and establish relationships between these two tables so we could grab data from both of these tables to include them in our report. So this was a basic example of how we can create a pivot table based off our data model. And in the next video, we'll see a few more examples and also add KPIs, which stands for Key Performance Indicators, to our pivot table.